We often imagine slavery as a sudden, violent act, a raid in the night, a seizure on a dusty road, a single moment where a life breaks in two. But systems that last for centuries, that shape entire civilizations, rarely rely on chaos. They rely on something quieter, more patient. In many parts of the medieval Islamic world, the path into slavery didn't begin with screams. It began with observation. People weren't simply taken because they were there. They were what? Measured, classified. The goal wasn't just immediate strength, it was long-term usefulness. They looked for children young enough to adapt, to forget. They sought women healthy enough to endure long journeys and new lives. The ideal person was someone who could be reshaped without leaving too much of their former self behind. The entry point wasn't always a violent raid. Sometimes it was inherited, passed down through generations. Sometimes it was the false promise of protection in a dangerous world. And sometimes it was a decision made by a family member, a chief or a king, a choice that sealed someone else's fate. But once you were inside the system, how you arrived no longer mattered. All that mattered was what you would become. Some children were raised inside the households of the powerful. They learned multiple languages, the intricacies of administration, the doctrines of religion. From the outside, it could almost look like an opportunity, a path to a better life. But from the inside, it was a state of absolute dependence. Everything you had, your food, your name, your very future could be withdrawn the moment you stopped being useful, the moment you no longer fit. For enslaved women, the system operated differently. Not louder, just quieter. Their presence was often erased from the official records. They weren't always listed in ledgers, not always counted in a census, but they were the invisible engine that sustained the daily life of power. They cooked their meals, they raised the children, both their own and their masters. They shaped lives that were never legally theirs to claim. The law did not ask for their consent. It didn't need to. Once the system stops asking questions, it stops needing to explain itself. The violence didn't have to be constant because routine did. The heavy lifting, the daily grind, the unspoken rules, the lack of alternatives, this was the true structure of control. Day after day, year after year, the system reinforced itself. History is filled with stories of enslaved individuals who rose to positions of incredible influence. They became powerful administrators, trusted advisors, even celebrated generals. These tales are often told as rare examples of success, as proof that the system was somehow flexible, even merciful. But what those stories always forget is the simple, foundational truth. No one had chosen to enter this life. Their loyalty wasn't built on gratitude for their success. It was built on the cold reality of dependence, when everything you are, everything you have, comes from the system. Challenging, it feels like you're risking your own disappearance. This model of slavery didn't require endless conquest to sustain itself. It reproduced itself quietly and efficiently, and that is precisely why it's so rarely explained in detail in our history book. Not because it was a secret, but because it made no noise. Empires are not held together by armies alone. They are held together by countless people who were never given the chance to even imagine another life. And when this system finally began to fade, When the laws changed and the markets closed, the damage remained because bodies can be freed, but the structures that held them captive, the ideas, the economic dependencies, those always survive a little longer. Thanks for watching. If you found this perspective valuable, consider subscribing for more stories that challenge what we think we know about the past. History often describes empire building as conquest, borders expanding, cities falling, armies marching, but it speaks less about recruitment. In the Ottoman Empire, one of its most effective systems did not rely on chains, it relied on procedure. It was called Devshirme, and it began quietly. Imperial officials arrived in Christian villages across the Balkans. They did not come at night. They did not burn homes. They came with lists. Families were gathered. Boys were lined up. Not all were taken. Only the right ones. Too weak, and they were useless. Too strong-willed, and they were dangerous. Age mattered. Health mattered, intelligence mattered. This was not punishment, it was selection. The boys were removed from their families and transported far from their homes. Names were changed, languages replaced religion, memory was the first thing erased. They were raised inside the state itself, educated, trained, disciplined. From the outside, this system is often described as opportunity. Some boys rose high, very high. Generals, administrators, advisors to the Sultan himself. But opportunity assumes choice, and choice never existed. The system did not ask whether a child wanted power, it decided what that child would become. Loyalty was engineered, not demanded. By severing family ties early, the empire ensured something crucial. The state became the only parent left. Disobedience no longer meant punishment, it meant isolation. And isolation was worse. These boys did not serve because they loved the empire. They served because it was the only world they remembered. The Devshirme did not need constant violence. Its strength was routine. Each generation fed the net. Each village knew the pattern. Resistance faded into resignation. Some parents hid their sons, others mutilated them to make them undesirable. Many did nothing, not because they agreed, but because the cost of refusal was understood. The empire praised this system as efficient. Historians later praised it as innovative. What is rarely said is that it functioned by making identity conditional. Belonging was granted and it could be revoked. When the system finally ended, it was not because it was cruel, it was because the empire itself weakened. The damage had already spread across centuries. Children raised without choice, power built on obedience. A state that did not conquer bodies but replaced lives. Empires do not always enslave with chains. Sometimes they do it by raising you themselves. Thanks for watching. If you found this perspective on history interesting, consider subscribing for more stories that challenge their conventional narrative. Most systems of slavery are remembered for what they took: labor, freedom, lives, but some systems were designed to take something more permanent. In large parts of the medieval Islamic world, enslaved boys were sometimes selected not for what they could do, but for what they would never become. they were chosen to be eunuchs. The process did not begin in palaces, it began far away from them. Boys were taken from Africa, the Caucasus, or frontier regions, often through long, brutal trade routes that filtered the weak from the strong. Only those who survived the journey were considered worth the next step. What followed was an act so violent it was never described in official record, because official records do not describe losses that benefit power. Castration was not a punishment, it was a transformation. Those who survived it became something rare, and rarity creates value. Eunuchs could not form dynasties, they could not legally pass power to children, they could not threaten their line of succession. This made them uniquely useful. They guarded the private quarters of the powerful, that they managed vast households, they controlled access to rulers. In some courts, they held more influence than generals or advisors. From the outside, they appeared to be the most trusted figures in the empire. From the inside, they were trapped. Their entire position, their safety, their very existence depended on the system that had destroyed their future. Loyalty was not expected. It was guaranteed, because where else could they go? What other life could they have? Many did not survive the procedure. Those who lived with bodies permanently altered, their identities suspended between categories. They were not considered men, and they were not women. They were not free. The system justified itself quietly through appeals to religion, to tradition, and to necessity. It claimed it was creating order. It claimed it was ensuring security. It claimed it was preserving the purity of the royal lineage. What it never claimed was mercy. These individuals were not enslaved to work fields or build monuments. They were enslaved to stabilize power. And they did it so well that the system lasted for centuries. When modern historians describe eunuchs as powerful figures, they often stop there at the influence, at the access, at the title. They rarely ask what it costs to make someone safe enough to trust. They rarely ask what must be taken away from a person to make them completely loyal. Empires too, not only controlled by force, they're controlled by removing futures. And once the future is gone, obedience becomes simple. Chains are visible. The absence of what could have been is quieter, but that absence lasts forever.